in special partnership with and brought to you by our friends at FLYN. Today on Soulfront, where we explore personal, social, and workforce transformation, we have Shahzia Noorally. Shahzia is a human resource professional and the co-host of The Color Gap, a podcast where she celebrates her Pakistani and Muslim heritage, what it means to be a woman of color in leadership, and she discusses the unique and often uncomfortable truths of being a woman of color in business. In the show, we explore what the color gap means, why it needs to be addressed, and how we can have positive change to narrow this gap. I highly recommend you check out Shahzia's podcast, The Color Gap. It'll be in our show notes, so please check it out. And without further ado, let's get into the show. Shahzia, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for taking the time. A little introduction of you before we begin. I have you as a self-proclaimed proud introvert, which is a cool thing. Also a personal branding nerd who believes in the power of social media and to elevate conversation and results for people and businesses. You're a human resources professional, co-host of The Color Gap, a podcast where you celebrate your Pakistani and Muslim heritage, what it means to be a woman of color in leadership, and you also explore the unique and often uncomfortable truths of being a woman of color in business. I'm really excited to explore this topic of the color gap. So thanks so much, Shahzia, for just taking the time.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm so honored to be able to make this connection and dig a little deeper on your platform on something that is very near and dear to my heart, and just really appreciate the opportunity to explore these things with you.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have a lot of fun. For me, I'm a husband of a person of color, and I have mixed race children. And in the past, if you asked me if I thought of myself as somebody who understood inequality, I'd say, yeah, I probably know it better than the average person. But in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, what I'm finding is that I really honestly don't know as much as I thought I knew. One thing I found is that your podcast has been great. It's given me a deeper understanding of people of color, how they feel and how they think in the workplace. Just aside from that, though, I love your authentic conversational style. Your co-host Susie Coe, and you have this awesome chemistry. So I'm jealous. And great work, and keep it up. But my first question is, can you tell me what the color gap means to you, and a little bit more about the podcast?
Yeah, of course. So the podcast was really incepted through lived experience. And so Susie and I met, we worked together in another organization for a number of years. We met about probably 6 years ago. And it was one of those moments. We had gone to Banff for an HR conference as a team. And it was my second week at the company, and I knew nobody. And when you're in an HR team, typically what you find as a person of color is you're one of very few. And I remember seeing Susie and being introduced to her and being I just felt home with her. She's Korean Canadian, I'm Pakistani Canadian, and there was something about that lived experience, that shared connection. We just bonded instantly about being women of color in an industry and a part of business where it's primarily a lot of white women, and you don't necessarily see yourself represented in leadership, in a lot of different voices that think anything like you or really come from experiences that are similar to yours. And so that's really where it started. And primarily the biggest sort of trigger was when I got into a leadership role. And it was that moment of being I don't actually have any role models to really look up to that have carved this career path that I'm trying to carve myself. And a lot of what Susie and I started talking about is that a lot of the conversations that people have around equity and equality, it always stops at the lens of gender. And there's not a lot of intentionality or thoughtfulness put into the experiences of people of color that, do have different ways of which we navigate the world, or raised in households and cultures that may not be representative when it looks at the ways in which North American corporate cultures may be designed. And her experiences were really vastly different from mine. And that's what was so fascinating. She comes from a background in a culture where she was quieted a lot. And I come from a background in a culture where the women were really encouraged to get educated. I see a lot of women in my own community that become professionals and really making an impact in the world. But we also still have a different roadmap to kind of get there. And it's not kind of the lean in mantra, as we call it. And so that's where everything started with the podcast. And we thought, you know what, let's just take a chance and start putting our stories out there. We have things to talk about. We want to start being a little scrappy in our approach and a little bit resourceful. We definitely don't have a lot of sophisticated technology to support the conversations, but we just started the dialogue, and it's grown from there. And we've just had a lot of amazing opportunity to connect with not only other women of color that have, you know, resonated with the experiences that we've talked about, but also a lot of allies, a lot of white people that have reached out to us that are leaders in organizations that, you know, want to understand how they can be better allies to people of color. And like I said, with everything going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's really brought things to the surface in such a new and unique way. And we're really grateful for that in many capacities. Obviously, the way everything happened was so tragic and completely inhumane and awful. But there's some hope that's coming out of it, a bit of a silver lining around the fact that the conversations that a lot of people of color have been having for a long time are now finally starting to come to mainstream attention. So that's kind of where it started, and where we're hoping to keep it going is just educating and empowering other women of color on the fact that they have the right to take up all the space in the world that they desire.
Yeah, no, I think it's awesome. And I'm so happy that you've started this conversation. And for anyone who's out there, your podcasts are you know, informative, but they're also a ton of fun. They're enjoyable to listen to. You know, I saw a presentation of yours, and in the talk you mentioned a quote from, I think it's John Sumser, and it was, "HR is a 47-year-old white woman." And you know, most people chuckle or laugh when they hear this, but you know, probably in a lot of cases it's true. But you know, what people seem to miss is that, you know, did they ask the question, is, you know, why is HR a 47-year-old white woman? And then kind of beyond that, like, is there anything wrong with that? And I find that you and Susie definitely know what it means to dig deeper when it comes to these subjects. Like, what did you realize, or when did you realize that this color gap conversation really needed to be explored?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of it came from the fact that when we worked for a really progressive organization together, and it was a lot of conversation around a sense of belonging within the company. And, you know, employee resource groups that were popping up that were really focused intentionally on elevating the experiences of different minority groups, whether it was women, whether it was our Indigenous team members, it was our LGBTQ team members. There's lots of different resources and groups that were popping up that really had a sole focus on that. And I think you see that across a lot of different corporations and organizations. But what we found, and what really triggered this sort of aha moment for us, was that none of the efforts around diversity, inclusion, belonging could really move forward unless things were really recognized at the top, and that there was buy-in from leadership, from CEO down. And that's where we struggled. It's like a lot of times what happens is you get really well-intentioned people going into diversity roles that don't get a lot of resources, don't get any money, and don't have a lot of power to actually do anything with their platform. And that was this aha moment for us. Like, we work in HR where we're supposed to be representative of the team member population. And we certainly, no HR team that I've ever worked for has ever been remotely like that. It is a profession where naturally a lot more women are drawn to the profession, but it's completely not diverse. And there's this almost like this hypocritical perspective around touting the virtues of diversity to the business leaders that we support, but not actually walking the walk in our own hiring practices, in our own succession planning opportunities. And it was just this moment of like, we need to call this out. And we did a Disrupt HR presentation on it. And that was the one slide that got the most reaction from the crowd. Because it felt true for a lot of people, right? Like, they could relate when they saw that. It was a little bit jarring. And what gave us a little bit of a chuckle was that it was a white man that actually said that. It didn't have to come from a person of color. It came from a white man who saw that and recognized it. And so it's been through a lot of our experiences working in organizations where we haven't seen the HR teams really represent any of those things that we talked about, and where we've seen a lot of great intentions, but no actual meat behind the message to get the work done and to get the message really amplified.
Yeah, just kind of going a little deeper into that, I dug up some facts about women of color, and I just want to go into it a little bit. Like in 2019, the most common corporate target for women executive officers was 30%. But what was wrong with the statement was that it didn't say anything about women of color. It just said 30% kind of across the board. And most of these board positions, are filled by white women. Another study by Fortune 100 executive board members showed that in 2004, 3% of seats were held by women of color. And in 2018, this number increased to a whopping 5.8%. So 5.8% is only 2.8% over 14 years. And women of color make up about 20% of the US population in this case. Like, I'm just trying to paint a picture of how stark this gap is. Like, Shahzia, like, what are your thoughts on the size of the gap, and why is the color gap issue so important to you personally?
Yeah, I think the size of the gap is so reflective of a lot of the practices that organizations have around talent management and succession planning and recruitment as well. It definitely starts there, where a lot of times what tends to happen is that, say I'm, a white man in a leadership role in an organization and I desire to fill a role on my team. Immediately I'm going to go to my circle of influence. Who do I know? And if everyone that I know looks exactly like me, comes from very similar backgrounds, thinks very much like me, I'm just going to be pulling from a pool of people that are just a replica of myself. And that tends to happen because it's the path to least resistance, right? It's the easiest way to get from A to Z, not having to necessarily go through a really extensive recruitment process where it's a lot of highs and lows. It's a lot of very cumbersome work to try to get to the heart of who people really are and connect and engage to find the right fit. It takes a lot of time, and a lot of leaders, they just frankly don't want to invest the energy because it requires a lot of extra energy on top of what they already have on the go. And so that immediately that gap gets widened because there's no ability to really tap into circles of influence that are not directly related to who you know. And, occasionally you'll find candidates that kind of slip through the cracks. If you go through a traditional job posting process and you go through that, you'll find folks that get through, but what they have is barriers in terms of actually being able to see themselves represented. And that's where it comes down to. Even when you look at a lot of these organizations, what you'll typically find is a lot of folks, people of color, that are at individual contributor levels, and they're not being promoted. They're not going into leadership roles. They're having to fight their way to get there. And it's the same thing. It's this confirmation bias of hiring people that look like us, that think like us, that aren't going to challenge the norm of what it is that we know, or be too difficult for us to coach and train because they make us uncomfortable in some way. And it might be because they have a different communication style. It might be because they may not have been educated here in Canada. And there's all of these biases that often are unconscious. I'm not saying that people are going out of their way to be discriminatory or racist or any of these things. Oftentimes it's with good intentions. It's just that A, you're not having an HR person who's going to be calling you out on it, or B, if you are, you don't really want to take the time to listen because it requires a little bit more effort. And so the gap just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you find a lot of people of color are stuck and not necessarily feeling like they have mentorship, role models, opportunities to even see themselves represented. And that's where a lot of the performative allyship comes into play. Like, we've seen that happen quite significantly with the Black Lives Matter movement, where you see a lot of organizations that I think almost felt pressure to say something publicly about their commitment to the movement, but not necessarily wanting to do the real work to reflect on how unrepresentative their actual team member populations were. So I found that some of them scratched the surface enough so that it wouldn't call too much attention to the fact that they really weren't doing the work internally, because it's uncomfortable. It's difficult to talk about race, all of these things.
Well, it's funny how we talk about it being uncomfortable. Like, if when you look at the conversations you go into your podcast, you do touch on controversial topics. It's crazy that they're controversial in 2020, but like, a few of your show titles include, are we crazy? You're really asking, Like, why isn't the color gap issue actually being discussed? Beauty narratives for women in color, what it means to be a model minority, how HR fails women of color, uncovering uncomfortable truths about the color gap. And I like this one, how to shine in a white man's world. These aren't easy conversations to have in a corporate setting, or just to have it all in some cases. Did you ever have any fears or doubts when you went public and raised these questions?
Oh, Scott, you have no idea. So much, so much. And there's a part of me that there's some sort of weird fearlessness that I have around some of these things. I don't know where it came from because, like I said, I'm an introvert naturally, and Susie is also a little bit like trepidatious around exploring some of these, and I'm the one that's always like, we need to just keep going and push it and just say what we need to say, because it's almost like you have to say these things to get people to pay attention to you, right? It's not like there's nothing clickbaity about it, but it's almost like you have to be a little bit more bold in your approach when we've been taught for so long to really quiet ourselves. And as women generally, but then as women of color, you're adding that layer. And it was difficult for sure. And it was difficult to even convince Susie to come along on the ride, because she was used to the idea of work hard, get noticed based on your hard work. And really it takes more than that, right? It takes this combination of a lot of different things to kind of get you into opportunities where you're going to be visible and seen. And definitely putting ourselves out there like this puts a bit of a target on our backs around the fact that we're a little bit too vocal and we're saying things that maybe other people don't want to say. I remember too, when we were trying to brainstorm the title of the podcast, we had so many different iterations, and some of them were way more controversial. And I actually have a woman who's a white woman who's a mentor of mine, who I trust immensely. She's a keep it real person, but has a real softness and an energy about her that it just really resonates with me. And I remember talking to her about, originally we were thinking of doing something almost like an ebook, and we were going to maybe evolve it into something more. And the title that I really wanted to use, which I don't even know if I should be saying this, but it was How to Be Like a White Woman. That was our perspective. It's like, because so much of the conversation, like I said, always stops at the gender lens, and there's never a lot of consideration around the different intersectional layers that make it more difficult to access opportunities and the equity conversations. And I remember Val was the one that said to me, she's like, maybe that's not the direction you want to go in, because you could really easily alienate people. And I agree 100% with her. And we've definitely moved a little bit more in that direction as we've kind of gotten a little bit more confidence in our voices and what we're doing. But for sure, we were very fearful of rubbing people the wrong way, or of eliminating opportunities for ourselves as well by talking about these things in a way that threatened those power dynamics and really made people question their own biases and their own assumptions about people.
Yeah, it's funny with these power dynamics. Like, I've got some more stats. In 2018, a report on U.S. companies showed, approximately 32% of new directors were women. So, the new ones coming on, only half of those people were people of color. And if you looked at a woman of color, would be a smaller group of that minority group. So many white business leaders, they claim that they're allies of people of color. But at the same time, there's this like weird disconnect with the corporate culture. Like, if anyone talks about white privilege, it's almost, you need to calm down, you need to follow the rules, you need to make sure you don't rock the boat. I think in one of your podcasts, you described this as an echo chamber for almost like white privilege. Can you explain what that means, like this echo chamber, and how it reinforces the status quo?
Yeah, it's almost like the confirmation bias, where you're surrounding yourself by people that think like you. They're not necessarily challenging the norm of how you approach problems and situations around people dynamics. And it's much more comfortable to stay in a space where you have people who agree with you and who aren't necessarily challenging, the fundamentals of those things around race and diversity. Because when you talk about race, and we're actually, the first episode of the Color Gap that we're launching for season 3 is around this topic about why is race so difficult to talk about. And the fundamental element of it is that it really calls into question our beliefs, we think of ourselves as really kind, nice people. We're tax-paying citizens, we're educated, we're all of these things, right? And we teach our children a certain way of navigating the world. And nobody wants to think of themselves as having biases, or even worse, being in any way racist, right? And so when you're sort of surrounding yourself by people that don't challenge those things, it's that sense of comfort. It's surrounding yourself by those voices that agree with you, that are not challenging the norm, because frankly, diversity and achieving a place of really getting to that forming and norming stage in your change process is really, really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It forces a lot of leaders to have to really step deeply into the uncomfortable space of integrating people into their team that don't think like them and that don't look like them and that may communicate differently than them. And it challenges people to really think bigger about leadership, that it shouldn't just be about bringing people into their group that really supports everything that they're already talking about, right? And so it's comfortable, and it keeps it that way. And that's where we talk about the echo chamber and the confirmation bias. It's just way more comfortable to do it that way.
It is comfortable. One excerpt of one of your podcasts was when I think you were in a group of people and you were in front of the CEO and you decided to ask a question because nobody was asking anything about just, equitable hiring. And you did it, but you had to overcome this fear. And over the years, you're comfortable with public speaking. You've become quite comfortable in your own shoes. And now all of a sudden you have this anxiety, and you have to ask yourself the question, it's like, why the heck would I have the anxiety to ask a completely, obvious question? And I think it's because there's just this overwhelming fear to stay in that comfort zone. And if you don't, there's this feeling that you might get ostracized or you might lose power. On another side of things, you recapped the second season and you spoke about the positives that came from being a woman of color. Your interest in raising up and empowering voices. You said successful people don't grow by accident; they grow by design. And encouraged women of color to focus on building their tribe, accelerating, redefining their success, focusing on progress over perfection, raising strong, proud, resilient girls of color. What have been some of your favorite insights from these shows?
Yeah, and I'll clarify that quote around successful people comes from someone. I can't remember his Thomas something, so I'll have to.
I'll put it in the notes.
Sure, that's perfect. I take credit for the brilliance there. I think the best thing that we sort of discovered through the process is that there's so much sisterhood and there's so much opportunity to, at the core of it, the fundamental issues like look the same no matter what race, what religion, what background we really come from. We're all struggling really to be seen and to be validated in some capacity, right? And when you think about the dynamics of those environments in a corporate world, it's always a little bit sticky because you're always trying to navigate, when do you put your armor on? Is it initially when you start the recruitment process and you have to kind of pretend to be someone else so you can fit in? And where does that sort of sense of belonging really start to show up? And that has been really interesting navigating through those conversations, because we just recognize such a common theme and a thread that you don't have to be a woman of color to relate to that sense of needing to find a place to belong and find community and some sisterhood in that. And what's been amazing is that we've just been so blown away by the sense of allyship that's really come from a lot of the white women and men in our lives that are, reaching out to have conversations like this and to say, what is it that we don't know, and educate us and tell us about those experiences in a way that, we can start to make some real significant change.
Mm-hmm.
And exciting to me is that there's just this opportunity to do something where, in a number of years from now, hopefully we won't need to have a platform like the Color Gap. We won't need to have diversity, inclusion, belonging roles in companies, because that will just be the norm of how we treat each other as human beings in a corporate environment, that there's not this sense of having to bake it into the culture because it just is what it is. And that's how you treat people, right? And so we found a real sense of renewed hope through the dialogue, because it's this opportunity to take some action and to educate and to really empower other women of color to see themselves as really worthy. Because, like I said, we haven't always had role models or roadmaps of success. And we all have these experiences that, they call them microaggressions, like things like people asking you, well, actually, where are you really from? You're not from Canada. Or, butchering your name multiple times, even though you might have met them, numerous times over different occasions. You're walking into those boardrooms and you're not seeing anyone that looks anything like you. We are finding camaraderie and sisterhood amongst a whole bunch of different races. And, like Susie's experience as a Korean Canadian is really different than mine, even though we're both women of color. But at the core of it, there's some fundamentals that we're finding that are real ties that bind. And that's been probably the most, uplifting and exciting thing about the experience, is that we're all in this together, kind of after the same thing. And there's a lot of opportunity there and lots of hope.
Yeah, like another part of just trying to bring people together and create connection that I've heard you mention is you've gone back to this theme, and that is in business we need to understand someone as a whole person. And I want you to kind of describe that. What does it mean by understanding somebody as a whole person, and why is this concept so important to be like a person of color ally?
Yeah, this is a great question. And, it's something that from many years of my HR career was spent in recruitment. And one of the things that I really struggled with is that there's not a lot of rules necessarily around how to navigate through a recruitment process, because it's going to look a little different for every organization. Some will be more open to a different approach, others are a little bit more traditional. But at the core of it, it was really about how do you get to the heart of showcasing who you are and your passions and your energy, without having to put that armor on in a way that doesn't allow you to be yourself. And a lot of organizations struggle with giving people the opportunity to show up fully and be themselves. And so the things that I used to always love when I was either hiring for my own team or even just, working with hiring leaders, is ask questions that really push us beyond the resume. Because a resume is this very, very pared down version. It's like an online dating profile. You're going to get a very small glimpse into that person's life. They're going to show you the things that they feel like you need to see, but not necessarily what it is that they want to talk about.
Mm.
And for me, I always used to my favorite interview question ever is, tell me about a character defining moment in your life that's made you the person you are today. And that question, first of all, will break down so many barriers with respect to that connection opportunity. And of course, you have to create a bit of a safe space in the interview, for people to want to feel like they can suddenly open up to you. But it really showcases a person in a totally different light. And it's not going to be about the fact that they're a CFA or that they graduated from this university or that they've had this job for this many years and make this much money. It is about those moments and those experiences that have created resilience, that have really made them tap into their innate sense of courage. I always use the example of people who have, particularly people of color who have immigrated to Canada. I find that there's a real bias in North America in general towards European immigrants with the cool accents, and anyone that doesn't have an accent like that is not necessarily seen in the same light. And there's such a sort of rhetoric around telling immigrants to just tone it down and to like try to Canadianize yourself as much as possible and take away all the things that really make you different. And it's like, to me, I want to know about your experience coming to Canada. Like that in itself takes so much courage, like immense amounts of courage to be able to just pick up your life. And whether you did that because you were forced to do it, which many people are, or because you just really desired to build a better life for yourself, that in itself that's the kind of person I want to hire, because that's the person that isn't afraid to take risks, that is courageous, that taps into something that a lot of us, like me, born and raised here in Calgary, the most I've ever done is move to Vancouver and, tried to struggle through that for a number of years. Like I could never compare. And I want to see someone like that come onto my team, teach me, and be the person that takes over my job one day. And that's where you get to the heart of the human being. And a lot of the things that we struggle with, I think even with everything that's going on in 2020, what it's really coming down to is the fundamentals of bringing it back down to the basics, simplifying your life, connecting with people human to human, listening to their stories, getting to know what is their life experience. And you can't get that if you're focused on the traditional approaches to connection, and especially in the corporate environment.
Yeah. Now we've talked about what it means to be a people of color ally, but I think it's equally important to understand what it means not to be a people of color ally. And again, it like sometimes it's not intentional. We're trying to be good people, but like in one of your episodes, you talked about this idea of white silence, where you have people in leadership positions, and you have this white silence, and how deflating it can be. Can you talk about that idea of white silence and how we can change this mindset?
Yeah, I think this is maybe a bit of a controversial perspective, but I often think that there are sometimes some spaces and places where, like, we find a lot of white women in particular that take up opportunities, I think, especially when you look at HR in diversity roles. And to me, if you're a straight white woman, you don't necessarily have a depth of lived experience to really speak to the experiences of people that you're trying to represent. Unless you're going out of your way to be really, really, really intentional about bringing those experiences into the fold, making sure that you have a really holistic sort of viewpoint, almost like a board of directors in your own capacity to get some perspective on the things that you're trying to put out that actually represent the lived experience of the people that you're trying to work for. And oftentimes it's about not necessarily stepping down from those roles, but Susie said something in a recent conversation that we had where she was like, you just need to make space for people to come in and to be able to have opportunity to talk about their experiences and their stories. And think about opening up opportunities in such a way that not necessarily, you're not hiring a person of color because it's a quota, but because you're expanding your circle wide enough where you have people of color that you're engaging with. That's really important. I also think that there's something about that performative allyship that really strikes me, because it doesn't even remotely scratch the surface around what not to do, right? It is about what really matters is doing a true audit on your own practices, your own beliefs, your own life, and really looking to understand, like, where are my gaps? Where am I really not getting it? Because if you don't have that self-reflection and that insight around your own life, you're going to be the person that's at that leadership table that is silent when it matters the most, because you haven't gone out and sought out those experiences that are different than yours. And you don't really truly understand that diversity is not just about doing the right thing. It is actually about fundamentally evolving your business in the right way. And you're never going to appeal to, people in CEO seats just based on the fact that it's the right thing to do. You're going to do it because it actually fundamentally moves their business forward.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit of a balance of both, but it's like, if you're not going out and seeking those experiences, even in the influencers that you follow, the books that you read, you're going to be that silent person because you don't necessarily know what to say. And if you do, you may not feel courageous enough to be able to say anything because you're in a room full of folks that also haven't taken the time to do the work, right? And to really educate themselves and to listen. So there's a need to really dig a little deeper and do a bit of an audit. And it's not even just white people. It's truly everybody that has the opportunity to really reflect in their own way, right? Like, I see a lot of my friends, I'm not going to call out any names, but last little while, it's like suddenly they're really woke around these issues, but yet they have practices in their own lives that, like, they will not go, they don't have any friends that don't look anything like them, that, they will never date someone that doesn't come from the same background as them, and all of these things, that the things that they're posting on Instagram, that doesn't do anything. It's about actually looking at your life and really figuring out, where can I contribute in a meaningful way that's personal to me. You don't necessarily have to have a seat at the leadership table or be a white person in a position of power to make a difference, right? It's about that self-reflection.
Yeah, like I think that's so important. Like closing this color gap in many ways, like you said, it does need to start at the top. And to bridge this gap, we need these senior leaders to understand the challenges that we just talked about and act and make policies for change. Like how, and this is kind of a final wrap up question, like how can we get this buy-in? Like where's the pressure need to come from?
Yeah, this is the thing is that's the million dollar question. And that's been, I think if you talk to anyone that's been in the space of diversity and inclusion work, even in the last number of years, I mean, it becomes a little bit of a flavor of the month type of thing where people get really excited about it, but there's not any, like I said, any money or energy that's put behind it. And there's almost this burden of trying to build this credibility in that space within organizations where people really just don't care. And I think the only way you actually get action is really meet people where they're at in terms of what is important to them. And you're talking to a CEO, you're talking to senior leaders. At the core of it, what they really want is to advance their business. And the altruistic side of things doesn't necessarily weigh as much, unfortunately. We're just not in a position as a society, as many corporate organizations just aren't in the role of being philanthropists, right? They're not nonprofits. They are for-profit organizations for the most part, and that's what you have to appeal to. You have to really start to tout the virtues of diversity from the perspective of how good it can be for the business. And it's uncomfortable, but it is possible to get there if you can appeal to people on that level and then start to infuse more opportunities for connection and belonging through storytelling, through different mediums of education and experiences that you can infuse into the organizations that you're a part of. But it really, unfortunately, has to appeal to the bottom line to begin with. That's the only way it's effective.
Yeah, like the other side of it might be as well the risk
Yeah.
for inaction. And like, I mean, the dial has been turned in a way, like maybe over a short period of time, and then maybe it'll go back. Hope it doesn't. But also the pain if they don't make the changes. And I'm wondering if kind of the new generations that are coming up are going to think the same way as the past leaders have. And I don't know if it's a cancel culture kind of philosophy or whatever it is, but if pressure can be put on a different way to say, I mean, there's a reputational risk. So,
Which is sad to think that that's the way you get attention, but unfortunately, it appeals to the bottom line, right? There is a reflection. And sometimes, too, when you're thinking about consumer facing businesses, it's a reputation factor, but it's also wanting to reflect the consumer base that you have and building products for consumers that they can connect with and relate to. And you can't assume that all of your consumers and your end users are going to be, one homogenous group, right? And so it appeals to them in that way because that's where you can actually get some really powerful user experiences, right? By creating for your end customer. So there's a lot of different business angles, and it's unfortunately the capitalistic route, but it's the only way that seems to work to get people to pay attention.
oh my God. Shahzia, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. If people want to check out your podcast, I'll put it in the notes below, and as well your different ways to connect with you on social media. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.
It's great connecting.
Thank you for your support. Please remember to click subscribe so we can bring you more remarkable interviews with extraordinary leaders.